So here I've got 3 shutters, 3 lenses. This is from a Retina Reflex, this is from a Automatic, and this is from our Paxette. I've got it sitting upside down on the front plate from a Retina Reflex at the moment, just to have a handy place to support it while I show you what's happening. Here I've got their respective lenses. Now the deal with these mounts is they're all keyed to lock out the opposition's lenses. Was probably completely unnecessary, but that was the practice, to lock out the opposition. And how do they go about locking out the opposition? Well, basically what it amounts to is that these are 3-pronged bayonets, and in each case they have a protrusion on the mount in different positions, and in each case the matching lenses have a notch to match the position of those protrusions. So the protrusions are the nuisance for us, not the notches. The notches can't cause you any problems because a notch can't interfere with anything. The protrusions are the problem. So if we wanted to make a camera that would take a Automatic lens, a Retina Reflex lens, or a Braun Paxette Reflex Automatic lens, we would need to remove the protrusions in the lens mount in each case. We don't need to do anything to the lenses, and by removing the protrusions in the shutters in the lens mount, it means that you could fit any lens to it. If you start altering your lenses, you would end up with smaller bayonets in each case, and more importantly probably, you have to do each and every lens that you want to use. So I can demonstrate this further because I have a Automatic M camera that I modified some time ago so that it would accept Kodak lenses as well as the Voigtlander lenses. Well, in practice it'll accept all 3 lenses because there is nothing on any of the lenses that would preclude it as long as there is no protrusions. I'll get the camera. So here we have a Automatic M, and you can see that there are no protrusions in either of the 3 areas there. And I'll just remove the red tape that I'd put on the lenses to demonstrate where their various notches were, and we can try these lenses in turn. So the Automatic lens couples in no problem at all. Our Retina Reflex lens, likewise no problem fitting that. Now most likely our Braun Paxette lens, exactly the same. So the key to making your Retina Reflex, your Automatic or your Braun Paxette able to accept any of the lenses is simply to remove the protrusions like this, like this, and like this, that otherwise block one of these 3 sections there. So that Paxette one that I've got there, I'm just going to grind out that little nuisance, and then it will accept any of the lenses. Now to make this Paxette shutter accept either the Paxette lenses or the Retina Reflex lenses or the Automatic lenses. We just need to remove this unwanted protrusion right here. And so what I'll do is I will take this, remove the shutter from it, and then attack it with the grinder. And by grinder I mean Dremel. Let's see how we go here. Move the 3 screws, lift off the shutter, lift off the ball and the plate and the little pinion gear. And this tiny protrusion is our offending piece. I'll go away with the Dremel and remove that, and then we'll put this back together. Well, as you can see, I've ground out that protrusion that we had there, so that's all good to go. And now it'll mount any of the lenses. So here I have a Kodak lens from a Retina Reflex. Goes straight on. So our mount is dealt with, and I can assemble the shutter back to this part. Alright, let's get these pieces back in place. The first is this little pinion. I'll just put a tiny wipe of molybdenum paste through that, and that sits over its pivot here. Our shield from the front of the shutter fits over a post here. And the ball, the detent ball, fits on that pin, that spring rather. Now you need to put something on there to keep the ball in place while you're fitting it. Here I'm using a little bit of that molybdenum paste again, but you could use grease to do that job. But whatever you use, you're going to have to use something, because otherwise that'll just fall off. Okay, so now I can put the shutter back on here. Here's our finished, cleaned and ready to go on shutter. Now, these little indentations here, they give us our detents for our shutter speeds. That ball drops into one of those detents and gives you the nice firm click. So I'll just run a little bit of molybdenum paste on there. That's all that's required. The shutter, you'll notice that one of these 3 posts has got a groove beside it. That groove fits over this post here. So the shutter goes on like this. Now, putting this in place, what I suggest is you put your 3 screws in very lightly, because there's a good chance that the black baffle or shield on the front of the shutter has moved, and it's not uncommon for the ball to have taken the opportunity to jump off its post either. And that's not the only complication. They've got those 3 screws on lightly. Tip it over and have a look. Okay, so looking in here you can see that our shield here is not centered. You can see that there's hardly any brass showing here. There's lots over there. You need to pull this across. That just dropped into place. The coupling that runs through to that little pivot, that pinion, is coupled to the cocking action. We need to make sure that that's coupled correctly, that it hasn't moved, that basically the teeth are in mesh, that they're not sitting on top of each other. So I'll just... did you hear that click? That meant that the teeth were sitting on top of each other instead of meshed. So that's dealt with. I can tighten those screws up lightly again, and there's quite a bit of movement there because the shutter must have been well back. So now we've got that in place, I'm going to check the detent for the shutter speed settings. That clicks nicely into place. This is the B setting at that position there. Alright, so I'm happy with the state of that. I'll tighten those 3 screws up because we don't need to come in here again. Not for a while at least. That's our shutter ready to go back on the front of the camera. Okay, I'm going to carry on putting this shutter back together. This is the little pinion that passes through the shutter and couples to the setting of the aperture control. Just drops in there. Just giving this a wipe with molybdenum paste. You could use graphite grease, but use grease sparingly. You don't want to get any of this particularly greasy because stuff will stick. You've got a lot of broad flat surfaces, lots of contact area, and stuff will stick. That won't move smoothly at all. Okay. The shutter speed settings ring here. Now there's a cutout visible here past these notched areas. Now that's where this thing needs to actually move. When you reach the B position here, you can move beyond that. The ring will move beyond that and pick up the shutter speed setting tab as you move back to it. That's to allow your meter to indicate exposures longer than 1 second. Even though there's no control on the shutter for longer than 1 second, the shutter would be set to B. You'd be making those longer exposures manually. So I'll pop that to one side. Let's put the other components together. Here's the aperture setting ring. Now I'm not going to do much in the way of lubrication here. I've got a soft graphite pencil here. I'm just going to run that round here. And getting this thing on, you'll see that there's a little hook shape here. That hook has to couple up to the end of this spring. and stretching that out slightly in an anti-clockwise direction, you have to get this tab here in the slot in the side of this case. It drops into a slot down in here. So now this thing is sprung loaded. Now that spring's not present on the Bessamatics, and I thought it wasn't present on the other Paxette that I dealt with, but perhaps it had been there all along. Perhaps I just didn't notice. It's certainly present on all the retinas. Right, this ring, this brass ring, I'm just going to run some graphite around these top edges and round here, round the inside for good measure. Now this sits on here. It's a bit interesting to get on. There's a little semicircular cutout visible just where my finger is there. That's to allow you to get it over this little gear. And this needs to rotate, because where you fit it, it's not where it's going to end up. It rotates, and what we're interested in here is there's a groove across here in this aluminium piece. Now what we want is this brass tab here at the end of that cutout to be up against that groove, and that's the correct place for it. The next piece to the puzzle is this thing. This is the piece that opens the lens up to maximum aperture for viewing, and this is often sticky in a camera. It fits in there like that. Now the third tooth here on this curved rack should be in line with this pinion. Now that piece should be ready to put on the shutter now. Of course it's awkward, everything's awkward. So what I'm going to do is hold the shutter up in one hand. The shutter speed is set to B. The pinion has to drop down through that hole in there. If everything goes smoothly, the holes will line up. I can tell it's not right because things are sitting up here. I've got a gap underneath these rings. I'll give it a wriggle. It's not seated. Yeah, our setting ring here for the aperture is not seated correctly. I can tell that's what's happening. Lift those back off. I've taken off the shutter speed setting ring there as well. Checking I've got these aligned. B and f1.9. Of course you can't see any of this because of the camera, hang on. B and f1.9 should be aligned. This inner brass ring should be where we left it, and it's not at the moment, so I've got to move that round to where it was, there. Then put this piece on so that the B aligns with the f1.9. these pieces are together and correctly placed. Now I'm about half a stop out, I'd say. A stop. Half a stop. What I'm doing is these notches that you see here, we're engaging with this wheel, which is also engaging with the aperture ring on the other side. And they should engage in such a fashion that when this brass ring's where it's supposed to be, B and f1.9 will line up. That's it there. So I've got that timed correctly. You can put these rings on the shutter like this, and that's what I'm going to attempt to do. So I'll try fitting this to the shutter. It's going to take a wriggle to get that shutter speed lever seated onto the post in the shutter. I think it happened. I think that happened. Let me get the screws in place. You're trying to get too many things coupled up all at the same time is the problem. The shutter speed setting ring has to couple up to that tab coming up from the shutter. The pinion coming through that's going to open up the aperture to viewing point, that has to come up at the right time. It's got to be timed correctly. You've got to keep your B and your f1.9 aligned there on those scales. The brass ring's got to be in the correct position. So you're watching about 5 things at once. So it very rarely goes together first time correctly, but it will go together. I'm just checking that this will move. That's coupled to the aperture, to the setting of the aperture. The shutter speed ring, I'm not getting a click stop. That tells me something's wrong. And what's wrong is probably that my shutter speed setting ring hasn't picked up that tab on the shutter. So I've got to take it apart. And I have another go. This is the same process you'd do on a retina reflex. On a retina reflex I do this after the shutter is all back on the front of the camera. There's no special reason to do that in this case. Just checking I've got the third tooth lined up here with that pinion, that's about right. That my brass piece is in line with that notch, that looks right. The shutter speed dial is correctly placed. This spring is dropped out of place. The brass ring is just not engaging with these dials correctly. It's catching on something. I'll have to have another go. The shutter's slightly awkward for me to work on because the dials are upside down to the shutter compared to what they would be on a Retina Reflex S or 3 or 4. That just makes it a bit awkward to handle. Oh, well, I think it went together that time. Let me get it back in this case so I've got somewhere to park it while I'm doing the screws up. Now last time the shutter speed settings dial was not coupled to the tab on the shutter. Everything else looked like it was doing its job. Hopefully this time, starting with that tab connected, we should be in business. I've got my click stops. So that's good. That looks very hopeful. Okay, tighten those screws down. Now the aperture setting on this camera is done from the back. This gear here. See if I can get this on the shaft so we can just rotate this. I want to see the aperture scales move. Okay. Yep. That works. And it's spring loaded. It moves smoothly. If I hold this setting wheel, you'll see that the shutter speed and the aperture scales counter-rotate. And they should move right through the full range from f22 at 250 seconds through to f1.9 at a 500th of a second. So that shutter is complete. Just checking those 3 screws are tight. This one's awkward because it's underneath that tab. We can probably put that gear on there and roll that away. Alright, that's done. So that's the shutter itself, all done. On the back of the shutter, a little pinion, our gear wheel here has to go on that shaft. It's got 2 tiny screws. They align with 2 tiny indentations on there. I'm not sure whether it's best to put this on now or wait till it's back in the camera. I'll leave that on there loosely. This arm goes on here. It has a special job. It has to lock things up, locks the shutter and the capping plate together. It should press on there like that. And I'll press it down pretty much all the way. I don't want it scraping on this plate. I'm checking how much, yeah, I've got clearance there, that looks good. And this little tab goes on the top. This is the piece where the action on the camera actually cocks the shutter through here. So that looks good. We can actually cock the shutter with this tool I've got. And what have we got it set to? A 30th. Let's set it to something nice and slow. An 8th will do for demonstration purposes. And the shutter release is here. So the shutter's all working nicely. I just want to check and see how well this does fit in the case with that pinion on it. No, it looks like it can be fitted. But before I do that, this is their mirror box that the shutter needs to fit to. Now you can see it's got a matte black finish here. Now whatever that finish is, it's gone basically. The shiny parts that you see there is where the surface is gone. And cleaning it doesn't bring the matte finish back, it just leaves you with the shiny surfaces. However, all of that is outside the area that the lens will be projecting through. And so it's not really important. It's not like you're likely to get flare as a result of that being like that. So this, what I'm interested in here, which you probably can't see. Yes, you can just see. In here, there's remains of some foam rubber, some sponge. That was the buffer for the mirror. So as the mirror comes up, I can demonstrate how the mirror comes up. As the mirror comes up, it would hit this buffer there, and that sponge rubber, that buffer has just failed over time. So what I've got to do is remove the remnants of that, which means getting in there with some naphtha or something, or more likely acetone, to melt the adhesive, clean that out so that I can replace it with something else, and so that the mirror will have a decent pad to come up against, and more importantly that all of those chips of filthy crumbling old foam rubber are not there to settle on the mirror, settle on the prism, settle in the shutter and otherwise cause us grief.